So thank you, everybody. Delighted to be running another fraudulent episode of Ask Pav, where I answer no questions whatsoever, and I defer all the answering to one of our experts. Today we have one of my favorite. I mean, they're all the coaches I love to pieces, but Aitor is definitely up there. He has got some incredible knowledge, incredible coaching skill, and like I say every time we talk to Aitor, I love him being my coach as well, because it means that I don't really have to read any scientific papers anymore, because eventually it will appear on my training plan in some sort of form. So Aitor, how are you?
Hey guys, I'm fine and happy to be here again, and yeah, looking forward to answering some questions and yeah, giving some bits of knowledge here and there.
Fantastic. So everybody, we will be talking a bit about fueling your body today. So for anybody who needs a basic or even somewhat comprehensive look at the mechanisms behind how our body fuels, in terms of what that looks like, carbohydrate or fat reduction, and turning that into energy, rather than us talking about that today, which can be a bit lengthy, check back on either the YouTube channel or the bespoke podcast vault, because we've done a couple of episodes that touch on that. And so we're going to talk about the latest science that has recently hit us, which Aitor posted about in our Spokesfit Facebook group, which answers a age-old question about which diet is best for endurance athletes. Now, obviously, we're going to talk about this, but I'm fairly certain there's going to be some caveats in terms of there'll be some personalization and some location and everything like that. But the three diets in question are high fat, low carb, low fat, high carb, or a periodized approach. Now, for everyone on the call, I mean, the first two are fairly obvious. If you have a high fat, low carb diet, you are literally eating a substantial amount, or the majority of your energy comes from a fat and a low carb diet, and the opposite is true for low fat, high carb. But periodized nutrition is something that people might not be that familiar with. So Aitor, give us a little bit on what that actually means and how that works in practice, please.
Yeah, so the general idea is trying to tweak a little bit the carbohydrate intake and fat and protein intake, depending on what we are doing on the day. So maybe if it's a very hard day with intervals and high intensity, the carbohydrate intake is higher, and when the intensity is lower, maybe even if it's a long ride but with very low intensity, the carbohydrate is lower. And the main goal is to trying to get the best of both worlds. So when we are doing low carbohydrate training, we are trying to improve our use of fat and the ability to burn fat as fuel. And when doing the high intensity and the carbohydrates, we're trying to maximize the ability that we have to produce high amount of power with the high carbohydrates. So trying to be able to burn as best as possible both fuels.
That is the baseline or the basics behind periodized nutrition. What was the scientific study that you referred to in the group trying to prove?
So it was a study done by Louise Burke and her team, and she has been doing a lot of work on sports nutrition, and she's one of the leading authors on the topic. So they were trying to see which effects each of those diets had in performance. So they studied race walkers, because it's the group that they have most contact with. And what they did was switching the diet of the groups, and starting maybe with higher carbohydrates, then turning to higher fats, and doing those tweaks. And what they found was that the higher carbohydrate diets, either being periodized or high carbohydrate all the time, outperformed the high fat diet on a race. So they did a 10 kilometers and a 20 kilometers race, which is a standard distance on race walking. And the people doing the high carbohydrate diet and the periodized carbohydrate diet outperformed the high fat diet. So the main goal was, and they have been doing these studies for some years now, and it was trying to corroborate what they found in previous studies and adding a little bit more of nuances to answer the open question. So in this time, especially, they tried to do a longer approach to the high fat diet and seeing if there is some long-term adaptations to it, to see if we allow more time, there is the possibility to improve the performance in the high fat diet. But despite some more time and some more time for adaptation, the results were the same, and the higher carbohydrate diets outperformed the high fat diet.
Some people who have done high carb diets, they don't like the fact that actually you do tend to, some people tend to get a little bit of lapse in energy or low energy later in the day. What would your advice be around fueling for that? Because I know you as a vegan, and I've seen what you eat. It's fantastically clean, and I'm in awe at most of it, because I think that probably that's the benefit of you not having a child, because I couldn't eat like that. It'd get thrown at me. But what would your advice be for people who are listening to this, who are actually like, okay, well, I like the idea of a high carb diet, but what I don't like is that low energy. Maybe it's something they're eating.
Yeah, so if we stuff ourselves with very processed carbs and sugars and refined flours and everything, there will obviously be some ups and downs in energy, because the insulin response to the refined carbohydrates is quite high, and that will lead later on to a dip in energy. So basically, what being on a high carb diet doesn't mean to eat sugar all day or to eat white bread and donuts all day. So if we are looking to maintain some steady levels of energy and still also preserve good health and optimize everything, we have to try to incorporate more whole foods like fruits and whole grains and beans. And so it's not about having a high carb diet based on all refined products and sugars, but having a high carb diet based on whole foods. And even it's true that some people may feel those downs, and it's trying to incorporate different things, maybe having more whole foods and not so many sugary stuff even during the rides. And oftentimes also, if during training there are very big dips in energy and there is a constant need to have sugars even in easy rides and short rides, probably, in my experience, is more connected to a low fitness and not much endurance rather than the diet itself. Because in my case, I follow a very high carb diet, and I don't have that many fats, and I can go for a 4-hour ride with some intensity and even fasted without eating anything, and I will go through it. So I think it's also about what to eat, trying to have whole foods and not so much refined products, because the energy will be more constant throughout the day. And then also trying to improve the fitness and not trying to do a 5-hour ride without having any food when fitness is not on point, because that will basically lead to doing too much training without being able to tolerate that training and having those dips. So the two main points is having more whole foods and not refined products, and also having the fitness that can tolerate the exercise that we want to do.
What's the reason for better performance from those on the high carbohydrate diet?
Yes, so the the main hypothesis, and that it seems quite feasible, is that the cost to produce energy when using fat is higher than the cost of energy to produce energy while consuming carbohydrates. So if we want to, in terms of cycling, if we want to produce, for example, 200 watts, to produce 200 watts, we need more oxygen consumption if we burn fat compared to carbohydrates. And then as our oxygen consumption is limited and we can't just increase it because we change the fuel, so we need to increase our fitness to be able to have more oxygen. Then at the same ability to consume oxygen, we can't produce as much power because we are at the same oxygen rate producing less energy using fat compared to carbohydrates. So the main idea is that the efficiency is lower because the oxygen cost to produce X amounts of watts is higher when using fat compared to carbohydrates.
Tell us a little bit about the results. Was there a baseline test set and then several tests? Was there percentages that each group improved or didn't improve by? Let's hear a bit more about that.
Yes, so they did some like usual testing of VO2 max testing, economy testing, and all that. But the main goal of the study was to compare the results in actual performance. So they did some races and they compared the performance. So they did an initial testing, doing looking at the performance at that point, and then after the interventions they did another test to see what the differences were. So when we look at the times, the high carbohydrate groups improved about 6% their performance, and the low carbohydrate group decreased their performance about 1.5%. So the main thing is that the oxygen cost will be higher at when using fat and when being adapted to use fat, and that will lead to a decrease in performance if there is not a very substantial improvement in VO2 max. So the thing is, we have to take into account that the duration of those races were about 1 hour or so. It depends on, because they did a 10 kilometer and 20 kilometers. So let's say in the 40 to 1 hour and a half range. So at those intensities, usually glycogen stores or carbohydrate stores in the muscle are not that limiting. So we can still do the exercise using just carbohydrates. In those cases, having the biggest or the highest efficiency possible is key to produce the most amount of energy using the ability that we have to consume oxygen. And to do that, using carbohydrates is the best. But then if we think about other kinds of events that go above 3 or 4 hours, in those cases, the glycogen stores and carbohydrate stores in the muscle are a limiting factor. And in those cases, having a greater ability to consume fat is probably beneficial. There is not much data on such long events. There is some anecdotal evidence, but the scientific consensus is that periodized carbohydrate approach would be the best for those kind of events, because you have the ability still to consume carbohydrates efficiently, but you have an increased ability to consume fat, and therefore keep your stores of carbohydrates higher for longer.
Excellent, fantastic. So Ewan has posted a question, and judging by the look on his screen, it looks like he's posting a bit more. He has just posted a bit more. So I'm just going to ask this. So going on periodization, what exactly is that? What do you change and for how long? Maybe he's got the wrong idea, but periodization to me suggests a change for a period of time. So maybe we could just touch on that and give a bit more.
It shows that there is not a single way to periodize nutrition, because you can do it in a longer term. So it can be up to 1 month or even more of changing your nutrition, but it also takes into account shorter term changes in nutrition, and it can be as short as within 1 day changing when you eat. So the typical approaches can be, for example, if you have a low intensity ride, for that day just consuming low carbohydrates and more fats, and that could be just in 1 day. But also it can be just in one meal, so it can be doing in the afternoon hard ride and then not consuming carbohydrates to improve the adaptations and what it's called sleeping low, so sleeping with low stores. And then that could be also extended in the next day, doing a depleted training, which Pav knows well what what it feels like. So yeah, it can be up to 1 month or even more, or it can be as short as 1 meal.
Horrible, horrible. That's how it feels.
I remember seeing the emojis on your Strava rides.
Yeah, they're the vomit
That's
ones
great.
for anybody that's not seen that. The vomit emojis.
No, thank you, Aitor. That really clears that up. Thanks for that. It's brilliant.
Fantastic. Good stuff. Well done. Thank you for the question, Ewan. And Aitor, that was a fantastic answer. I'm going to move us on to a question which I'm sure a lot of people are thinking, and we might even hear from Paul here, because he's probably the perfect example of losing weight. There's a lot of maybe challenges, maybe misconception, but on a high fat diet, people tend to lose a lot of weight. There's some obvious reasons around that. But people tend to shy away from a high carbohydrate diet when losing weight. I guess misconception, or probably doing it wrong. What would you think, Aitor? Is there any advice or anything for people who are maybe like vegan or who are tending to be more of the high fat, high carb side, that want to lose weight?
Yeah, so oftentimes when talking about low fat diets, there is not very clear how low the fat should be and how high the carbohydrates should be. And even we can find that in scientific studies where they term a diet low in fat when it's up to 20 or 30% of fat, and usually it's lower than that. But I think that the main goal to achieve losing weight on a high carbohydrate diet is trying to stick, as we said before, to whole foods and to not so processed foods, because the fiber in them is a very good it's a very good piece to bring down appetite and trying to stay satiated with food. So when we eat fiber, the receptors in the body feel that we are eating and they bring down the appetite. So I think that when doing a high carbohydrate diet is key to still focusing on having good nutrition. And we all know, or in general, it's seen as good nutrition eating fruit, eating vegetables, eating beans, legumes, and all that. So trying to stick to those less processed foods and not so much having processed foods, because oftentimes when we say high carbohydrate, people think about donuts, pizza, and those kind of stuff, and those usually are also quite high in fat. So trying to clear what is higher in carbohydrates and what are the good sources of carbohydrates.
So, Aitor, based on this latest scientific study, what is the best way to eat? What's the best nutritional strategy?
So, when thinking about performance, if the goal is a quite short event below 2 hours or so, or if the event can be longer, but the really decisive moments are quite short, it's clear that having high carbohydrates, if not all the time, periodizing high carbohydrate moments is key. And if it's longer than that, I think that using a periodized approach probably will bring the best results, because even if those results are not seen in shorter events, they will probably translate to longer events. One quite interesting finding of the study is that the high carbohydrate had a greater improvement than the periodized carbohydrate, so bringing into question the validity of a periodized approach. And that can be one, because the exercise and the training itself can act as periodizing, because those athletes were doing high volume of training and sometimes training twice a day, and that training already causes moments of very low carbohydrate availability due to the high volume and high training. So in the cases of people that trains a lot, high volume, and sometimes even more than one workout per day, probably periodizing the nutrition is not that useful, because it's already done and it's already caused by the training itself. And in the case of people that have limited amount of time and have lower volumes, probably there the periodized approach would bring some benefits that could be gained by doing higher volumes.
Ewan's got a question. A lot of people say you don't need to fuel for training that lasts less than 2 hours. Do you agree?
That's a tough one, because I think that it depends. So, for example, if that 2-hour workout is in the afternoon and you are planning to do a hard one in the next day, probably having some fueling during that workout will help, because you will use less stores that you have in the body. You will start recovering earlier, and the next day you will be in a good place. But if the two workouts are distanced in between by 1 day or more, I think that there is not that much of a benefit fueling for those kind of workouts. And if it's very hard, maybe having a sip of some carbohydrate drink can help, but there is not really that much benefit from having it in terms of how much fuel we have on board.
So if you've got your energy drink and you have that during the ride, you're saying that that won't help that ride particularly. So, you know, if you're struggling, that energy drink isn't going to help you recover through that. Is that what you mean?
If you enter the workout with already being, maybe not being topped and being a little bit depleted, then it will help, obviously, because you are providing some extra energy. If you are topped on fuel and you pretty much are as high as you can be in terms of stores, it can bring a benefit, because we have some receptors in the mouth that can improve the performance just by having the carbohydrates in the mouth. So in that case, it can also help, because it's like tricking the brain a little bit, making it think that you have more stores than you really have. So it can help in those cases. And if it's a 2-hour all-out effort, maybe also it can bring some benefits by adding a little bit more fuel. But in general terms, if you are well fueled prior to the workout and it's not 2 hours all out, then probably it won't bring that much of a benefit.
Thank you, Aitor. Absolute pleasure for having you back on. Any further questions can be posted to our group, and we'll tag Aitor and get him on.